What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. With me, as always, is Pastor Leo. We are here to help you take a next step in your relationship with Jesus. We're so glad you're here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 103 of the Grow Podcast, the first ever episode of the Grow Podcast without the former host of the Grow Podcast, Pastor Mike. Today it's me and Pastor Leo today.
It's you and me.
How you doing, Pastor Leo?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. As we talked about it last week on the podcast, I'm very excited to do this podcast with you. I like goofing off with you. I also like having serious conversations with you. I feel like I get to do more of the former because we don't directly work together all that often.
Right.
So when we get together, we usually just get to goof around and have some fun. So I'm excited to have more of the deeper conversations, dive into the book of Romans, which we'll get to in a bit here. But it's also weird for me. This is the first time I've sat here and looked over and it's not Pastor Mike.
That's true.
So I'll get over the weirdness about 5 minutes in and then we'll be fine.
Yeah, let's make it 5 seconds.
But no, all right, I gotta go. But I'm very excited. I'm excited to do the podcast. Have you ever listened to the Grow Podcast, Pastor Leo?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
No.
I love it.
Are you still going to listen now that you are?
No. Well, yes, I am. Because it helps me learn.
Sure, to get better. And yeah, that's that. When we first started the Grow Podcast, and I would watch the whole thing, like once we would get it edited and ready to get uploaded, I would watch the whole thing just to make sure it was okay, because at the time, Michael, who's our producer here and our tech human, he's waving. None of you can see or hear him, but he's waving. But he's certainly much better than I am with this kind of stuff, had more experience. But neither of us were, experienced doing this stuff.
Right.
So we were very worried that things were going to go wrong. So I would watch all of it, and I just did not enjoy watching and listening to myself on the podcast at all. But like you said, it definitely helps you.
I know the feeling.
It definitely, yeah. Well, and you do you do that with your sermons as well? Do you watch yourself preach?
Now I do, because I make those reels that we have, so I am forced to listen to myself. But at first it was very
They make you do that in school, though, right? Like when you go to pastor school.
Yep.
Don't they make you record your sermons and kind of evaluate yourself?
Right.
That's fun.
That's true.
I don't think anybody likes doing that. You have to be really, really different to really enjoy.
That is
breaking your own speeches down.
For the record, by the way, shout out to the people in the Philippines, because from what I heard, you have new subscribers.
We do have some new subscribers.
A lot of them are from the Philippines.
We get even so. It was something I was going to bring up here, but we might as well do it now. I can see the regions. I don't get to see specifically this person watched from this IP address at this place. Not yet. I will get that technology eventually. But yeah. But I can see different nations and everything. And even on the Grow Podcast, we've had consistent, very small percentage of our listeners, but consistent listeners from the Philippines checking out the Grow Podcast. We get higher views on it from the Philippines on our services, or especially on our worship content that we post on there. But so we've at least had some people joining us regularly from the Philippines. I have to guess now that we're going to have a few more people from PH Church checking it out now that their Pastor Leo, is going to be the main person here teaching on the Grow Podcast every week. So, what's up, PH Church / the Philippines?
Kamusta?
It's a goal of mine to go viral in the Philippines. I want to be a viral celebrity, but only in the Philippines. I don't want anyone else in the world to have any idea who I am, but I'm huge in the Philippines. So let's see if we can make that happen.
Well, literally too. You go to the Philippines, you'll be huge.
That's true. I would be huge. Yeah, that is a good point. A big 6'6" white dude walking around. I would be physically huge in the Philippines. Yeah.
You'll be. You won't be missed. When people look for
when I leave, I won't be missed, or they won't miss me.
No, they won't. You won't be missed.
That was almost really.
Where's
hurtful.
David? And then just look up.
Yeah, that's. I often am given the task of finding someone in a crowd. And I'm like, that's. I'm glad I can use my height for something good at this point. My sports playing career is over, so it's pretty useless in most areas. But just today, Hattie asked me to reach something off of a tall shelf in the kitchen area. I can find people in tall crowds, so there are still uses for me being obnoxiously tall and not fitting well on airplanes.
But yeah, it's it'd be great if we could do one episode like in the Philippines. Right?
Okay, you read my mind, because I was also thinking we definitely need to go to the Philippines to record an episode.
Like
and
on the beach.
It would be so much easier to do that if the demand was so high, because we've gone viral in the Philippines. So now we're back to make sure everybody back in the Philippines shares this like crazy.
And everybody, that's your job. Make this go viral.
Who's like the most popular celebrity in the Philippines? Who do we need to endorse us?
Are we looking for the younger celebrities?
Yeah, I think young. You wouldn't. You don't know the answer.
The last time I was there was like 2007.
Was it Manny Pacquiao back then? My list of Filipino celebrities is not large, so I jumped.
Well, Manny's a politician now,
right.
So hey. Right.
I mean, we
connections.
He can bring us there. That's fine. He can pay for us to do the Grow podcast in the Philippines. Is there a lot of air conditioning in the Philippines or no? Because I'm going to need air conditioning because it's hot and humid there, as we've discussed in the past.
Yes, it is.
And that's not my wheelhouse.
Well, lots of people go to the malls to cool down.
Oh,
that's why we have lots of malls.
Interesting. That's pretty smart. You put air conditioning in the mall, then everyone has to come to your store. Mm-hmm. I like that idea.
Smart.
So what we need to do is we need to open New Hope or PH Church. Mm-hmm. What? Pick a town. Pick a city in the Philippines.
Well, let's start.
That's not Manila, because that's the one
right.
I know.
No, let's start with Cebu.
Okay, Cebu.
Cebu
from the VeggieTales song.
Thank
you. I knew Michael was thinking. I knew Michael was thinking it too. Cebu. Right. So
Cebu.
I'm not gonna get it. You did say you wanted to do a Tagalog lesson today.
Well, here's the thing. For Tagalog, all our vowels are short.
Short.
Okay. So that's the thing. Like if you have an A, it's not an A, it's an A.
So just real quick.
Right.
Real quick. Okay.
So E is an E.
So
not
Cebu.
An A. Yeah. Cebu. There you go. See?
Aha!
See, that
all
was,
right. I nailed it.
There's a
that's
reason
gonna help
why
me,
I'm a speech therapist.
That's going to help me go viral in the Philippines.
Cebu.
Okay.
That's
Cebu.
it. Yep.
Nailed it. First try.
We
will edit all of the rest of that out. And it will look like I knew what I was talking about. Well, we should probably get to Romans here at some point,
okay.
Leo. Part of me wants to just do
the last 5 minutes.
Yeah. Part of me wants to do like a 50-minute podcast of just us goofing off, but I feel like that's not a good idea. Because the purpose of the Grow podcast was and will continue to be helping us grow in our faith, taking a next step towards growing. And so what it has been for the last 102 episodes, 101, last week was a little different, where we've just dove deeper into the weekend teaching and used it as kind of a tie into that. We're now going to, during this kind of interim period until New Hope has a new lead pastor, and then that person will get to decide what happens with the podcast. But for now, we're going to use it as kind of like a Bible study tool, kind of like an old school Sunday night, let's all head back to church and really do a deep dive here in some Bible study. And we're starting with Romans. If you're wondering why, listen to last week's podcast, because we talked all about that.
That's true.
And so for this first podcast, we were doing Romans 1, verses 1 through 17. We encouraged all of you to read it in advance so that you were ready for this, and we will continue to encourage you to do that. So, but if you didn't do that, that's okay.
That's right.
We're still glad that you're here. It's not like you're not. I had a professor in college who will not be named, but if he figured out that you didn't read like the reading for that day, he would specifically just call on you the whole class and then just sit there silently while you awkwardly had no answer. That's
fun.
But once you proved that you read, he just never called on you again. So I got called on like twice in the first week, and I had read, and then he never called on me again. So I was in the clear. I could have stopped reading at that point. We won't be doing that. We won't be calling you out for not reading, but we really do encourage you to read along with, because that's going to be the best way to study along with us. We don't want you to just be here and listen to Leo bring some wisdom. We want you to be engaging along with us. So make sure you're reading, but today we're going to be in verses 1 through 17. So maybe, Leo, you can start us off with giving us just some ideas, some things we should have walked away with as we read Romans 1 through 7.
If you're listening to this or if you're watching this, pause and then read 1 to 17
also
for that.
Good idea.
Yeah.
That's probably the best idea. You can pause a podcast.
Right.
That's pretty
pause
easy.
Pause the podcast and then go through it, and then let's talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's the right move.
Mm-hmm.
So give us some ideas or points we should have taken away as we were reading through.
All right,
1
so
through 17. Welcome back to all of you who just read Romans.
Yeah, welcome back for the second time. Okay, so the main idea of the discussion or of the verses is Paul's talking about how we should be unashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes deeper. First, he talks about the fact that we should be unashamed to talk to people, which is easy, right? For people who like to talk, especially for the extroverts out there. I'm not one of those. So, yeah, I'm with Pastor Mike.
We need to hire some extroverts at this church. We got a lot of introverts.
But yeah, for the extroverts out there, that's easy. Like talking to people, you should be unashamed to talk to people. But then he goes deeper. You should be unashamed to talk to people about Jesus and the gospel. And we went through this story recently, both New Hope and PH Church, by the way. So we talked about the gospel, which is just church talk for the good news that Jesus brings. So we should be unashamed to talk to people about Jesus and the good news that he brings. And then he goes even deeper than that, because he says that the gospel, the good news that Jesus brings, is the power of God for salvation. So that's just 1 through 17. So
this is why we're breaking it up into such. We're not doing Romans chapters 1 through 9 on week 1 in the podcast. So last week, before we talk anymore about anything else, actually, I want to ask you a question about that. We talked a little bit last week about the circumstances about writing this letter, and so again, go back last week if you missed it. But a lot of the letters of Paul were written for a specific reason. We talked about that, right? Like he wrote to the church in Galatia for a reason, like because this thing was happening there, he's addressing this thing that was happening. Right. Same with most of his letters. Whereas Romans is a little different, where it was just written kind of to like explain what it means to be a follower of Christ. Right. Why do you think he starts off with the need to be unashamed when it's like, okay, this is the beginning of the book, right? So this is kind of Christianity 101. Let's just kind of explain it, and we'll get deeper as the letter goes on.
Right.
Why do we think we start with being unashamed?
Well, before we do that, let's talk about Rome for a bit.
All right, I'm on board with that. Are we going to do history now, Leo?
Yeah, let's history 101.
I like that.
Okay.
Let's do history like 101.
We're going to geek out for a while.
Yeah. So, we've added another history nerd to the Grow podcast with Leo, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah, so we talked about Paul a lot last week. We didn't really talk about what was going on in Rome at the time. This was written between 57 and 59 AD. We don't, we obviously don't have the exact date on it, but somewhere in that area. So tell us a little bit about Rome, and I'll just interject my own thoughts about Rome as we go along.
Sure. So Rome at that time was the capital of the largest empire in the world. That is very obvious, especially for us who are very familiar with what Rome is and the Roman Empire. So I guess it's more like Washington, D.C.?
Sure.
Today, like the capital of one of the biggest empire of the United States, should we call it? So there are about 1 million people living in there in just Rome alone, including slaves. Many of them are slaves. And I took a very quick search on similar cities here in the U.S. and in the Philippines that have similar population sizes, and some of them are what we have here is Austin, Texas, Fort Worth, Texas. Have you been?
I've been to Fort Worth. I have not been to Austin.
Never been. So
Fort Worth is like attached to Dallas, basically. Like they kind of operate how like Minneapolis, St. Paul. For those of you that are in North Dakota, you might be more familiar with Minneapolis, St. Paul, like as twin cities. Fort Worth is, it's much smaller than Dallas right next. I mean, it's still very large, but it's smaller than Dallas. But
so there we go.
Dallas, Fort Worth metropolitan area.
Yeah, and that's good because you mentioned metropolitan. Jacksonville, Florida is another one, and Pastor Mike might be familiar with this one, I guess, is San Jose, California.
Of course.
For the Philippines, again, we mentioned Cebu.
One of my old favorites.
Right?
Yeah.
So Cebu, Zamboanga, Antipolo, and Taguig. Antipolo and Taguig especially are very near the metro.
Okay.
So if you're watching, you're from the Philippines, and you're familiar with these places, hello, we're waving. So those places have very similar sizes of population. So just like the metro, and since it's metropolitan, there are many slum areas, which is very similar to a city today.
Yep.
So it had an elite, wealthy society and a very large group of poor people.
Which had become even more, because Rome was a republic until technically until about 50, 60 years, but realistically probably 80-ish years before this. And then Julius Caesar became the first emperor of Rome, just never gave up his powers. And the gap, the wealth gap continued to, because the Senate still existed at this point, but the Senate ceased to be like what it was before, where they actually held power. They were actually, trying to be a voice of the people, and it just became the voice of the aristocratic elite, and they just continued to grow their power while the poor became poorer, just like most empires over human history. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Until
some people might say that history shows us that nothing's changed.
Isn't that weird how that happens? But yeah, the interesting thing about this specific time in Rome too was, before you get to any other things you want to talk about, so Emperor Nero was the emperor at this time, who we all think of as like one of the big bads, and he was one of the worst emperors. But 58 AD is when he had his mother assassinated, Agrippa, and that's kind of like when historians kind of see him as he just lost it at that point, because his mother had basically been a de facto ruler, because he became emperor at like 14, I think. And so she was just like, well, I'm going to run things through him. And then he obviously was like, let's not do that. And he like kind of banished her somewhere else, and then eventually he has her killed. And that's when we kind of see him lose it and become the Nero that we know of, the Nero who burned the city. Yeah. And he's also well known for persecuting Christians, and he was really the first emperor to do so. It wasn't necessarily happening when this letter was written. But even then, the persecution of Christians in Rome was very like local. Like it did eventually become on a broader scale before it became the national religion much hundreds of years later. But Nero did it, and like he was the first one to do it. And this is kind of his, like, right as he's rising to his full power, right as this letter's written, which just fascinates me to think about. Like that's when this letter from Paul is coming to these Christians, right as one of the most brutal, like, disturbed emperors is reaching the height of his power. That's when this letter was written. And they were in a really big war at the time with the Parthian Empire called the Parthian War. They fought a bunch of different Parthian wars, but this particular one, they were right in the middle of that too. So that was a nation that was where Iran is now. So they're in the middle of this big war. This crazy dude is reaching the height of his power, and then Paul's like, "Hey guys, like, I'm gonna tell you about how to be unashamed of Jesus."
Yeah, can you imagine what it would have been like if Paul didn't write this letter and Nero started doing what he did?
Yeah.
And there was no encouragement for the Christians in that place. Like, you should be unashamed and all of that. There was nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
you can see how quickly it might have been removed, at least from that area. Yeah.
It's like somebody planned
It's
all
almost
of this,
like God thought this was a good idea for Paul to write this letter. Sorry, please continue, Leo. Tell us a little bit more about Rome.
Okay. So of course, as we know, the Romans were at the forefront of innovative technology. They gave us the Roman numerals, for one, among other things. And they were also, well, as we know, because we're familiar, we saw it in the movies and on TV shows and whatever else, that they were also very immoral and very violent. In fact, their form of entertainment, we talked about this last week. I watched the WWE, and we know it's fake.
What?
What? Yeah. But they have the Gladiators. So that one's not fake.
Yeah.
So they were very immoral and they were very violent. So this is, as you can see, it's during this time in Rome, it was not like everything's peaceful, everything is like la-di-da. So it's a challenging time, even when Nero has not yet began his downward spiral. It was already a challenging time, and this is when Paul decided to write to the Romans to encourage them that they should be unashamed to talk about the gospel, the good news that Jesus brings.
And what can you, if anything, what can you tell us about the Christians from that time? Like the followers of Christ, what do we know much about them, or what things might have been like for them?
Well, we scratched the surface a little bit from last week. Again, if you're not familiar, go back to last week. But when Paul was writing this letter, the community of believers in Rome had not yet reached or had not yet received any face-to-face teaching with the apostles. So, which is different, because some communities, some churches had face-to-face meetings already with the apostles, and this one, it was just a group of believers who went to Rome, and then they kind of got together, but no face-to-face teaching yet from the apostles. And this is why Paul's letter to the Romans is more like a crash course in Christianity, because he talks about doctrines all the way to chapter 11. He's covering everything that he needs the Christians to know. So this is what Christianity is like. I haven't been there. Nobody has been there to give you guys knowledge, direct knowledge on what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means to be a Christian. And so he really goes into the details of everything. So all the way to chapter 11 is more like doctrines, and then chapters 12 to 16 after talking about the doctrines, is more like practical applications, which is why we decided Romans would be a good start, because if we want to grow, Romans is a good place. It's a good soil for us to get all the nutrients that we need for us to grow.
Yeah. So in these verses 1 through 17, Paul's talking about serving God, how important it is to serve God by specifically sharing that good news that we talked about before. We shouldn't be unashamed of that good news. We shouldn't be unashamed to talk to people about that good news. So why is it so important for us to talk to other people? So my relationship with Jesus is my relationship with Jesus, right? So why is it so important for me to then talk to other people about that good news?
And that's the interesting thing about this is because Paul shows us his motivation for sharing, and he describes himself as obligated as a minister of the gospel. He is obligated. It's not just something that he wants to do. It's not just something that he likes to do. It's not just something like, maybe I want to share this. No, it's more than that. He sees it as his obligation as a minister of the gospel to share it, which is very different from how many of us nowadays feel about serving God or sharing the gospel, even among our fellow Christians. When we talk about when we talk to fellow Christians, it's not. There's very little time when we talk about our motivation, how we feel that it's our obligation to share it.
Yeah.
So it's our motivation for serving God. Nowadays, it's more like, when I have the time, I'll do it.
Why? So, I mean, and clearly that was, again, Romans wasn't written like some of the other books where it's specifically addressing something. But if it's something that he's hitting at the very beginning of this letter, clearly it's this is something important that can easily be ignored, even just a few decades after Jesus was on earth.
Right.
But we look at the Great Commission, the last command Jesus tells us before he leaves, and he says, "Go and tell people."
That's right.
Why don't all of us feel that obligation all the time? Because I'll be honest, Leo, there are some times where I don't feel that obligation. I might feel it, but I bury it deep, or I try to, I get distracted. And maybe that's the best way of saying I get distracted from that obligation with other things.
That's true.
Why? But clearly it should be one of the main things for us. Why do you think sometimes it isn't?
Well, I think one way of looking at this is in verse 16, Paul says that he was proud of the gospel. He's proud of the good news that he was sharing. And sharing the gospel is not just his duty, it was his privilege. And nowadays we don't necessarily see it that way.
For sure, yeah.
Because everything is accessible. We've gotten so used to the fact that everything is accessible. You can download an app, it's there. You can listen, it's there. But if you think about it, not all countries around the world are like that.
Yeah.
There are many places in the world where having access even to a simple thing as a Bible is very challenging. And when we get to places like that, then we understand that sharing the gospel is not just something that we do when we have the time. When we go to places like that, and if you talk to missionaries, and that's why I have a very high respect for people who go on missions, because they go to places where the gospel has a more challenging time to reach hearts. So it becomes a privilege. Now you feel the privilege. Now you feel the obligation to share the gospel because it's not readily accessible.
And I think it's interesting too. You said, that like everything's available to us, and I very much agree with what you're saying about in places where it's not as accessible. But I feel like we almost have the opposite issue here, where there's too much information of it. If I'm a person who has zero connection to, I don't know anything about, who Jesus is, who God is, how I can have a relationship with him, and I just go on the internet, who knows what I'm going to find? There's going to be absolute chaos in my Google search because there's going to be 50 billion results that come up to my search. And I've even had a conversation just within the last probably 5 months with someone that I'm close with who asked me that question, like, how am I supposed to figure out who he is? Like I look on YouTube or I look on the internet and I have no idea what I'm looking for. And that really hit home with me because I have that thought that you were talking about where I'm just like, this person should be able to figure this out, right? Like download the Bible app, or like go find a Bible study. But if you don't have someone tell you like, no, this is what's true and this is the good news right here, and directing them to the right thing when they have too much information available, they can get go all over the place. That's where we see, like there's even back then, how many of Paul's letters are addressing false teaching in these churches, and even more, maybe even more so today with the
if they were
accessible
rampant
information.
Then,
yeah, right.
They're even more so now.
Yes.
So that's why we have to be unashamed because the people who spread false teachings are out there. And they are unashamed. And so if we are ashamed, if we're scared to talk about our faith, the gospel, talk about our relationship with Jesus, then what's going to happen? We're going to be overrun by those who are teaching false teachings. Yeah. So we need to be unashamed. Yeah. We need to be confident.
And let's talk a little about forgot how to speak here on the podcast. We'll edit that out. You guys will never hear that. Let's talk about Paul's confidence. Can you talk to us a little bit about he's so confident in the gospel and the good news? Why should we be so confident in the gospel?
Well, the key here is that Paul says that it is the power of God. The gospel is not just words. The gospel is not just our ideas, our opinions. It's not just our story. It's not just Jesus' story. It's not just words from the Bible. The gospel, Paul says, is the power of God. That's the key. Once you see it that way, once you see for a fact that the gospel is the power of God, then everything changes. The way you see how you're going to spread the gospel changes. The way the way you relate to the gospel changes, because now you're seeing it not just as something that's in the Bible. Now that you're seeing it as this is the power of God, and if this is the power of God, this is what I need to share. It's not about comparing religions. It's not about comparing doctrines. It's not about comparing practices or traditions. It's the power of God that we're sharing. And And in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20, Paul says that we are ambassadors of Christ, that we are the ambassadors. And if you think about it, you don't see ambassadors who are afraid to deliver messages. You don't see an
or at least they don't remain ambassadors for very long.
right? You don't see an ambassador. I think I'm speaking for the Filipino people. When I say, you don't see ambassadors who talk like that. You see ambassadors they're very confident, but the reason why they're very confident is because they know and they understand and they trust in the fact that the power of their country is behind them. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, let's repeat that. The ambassadors know that the power of their country, the entire country, is behind them. If I am an ambassador for the Philippines, I understand that the power of the Philippines is behind me. If you're an ambassador for the United States, you understand that the power of the United States, the entire country, is behind you. Imagine if we see ourselves as ambassadors of the kingdom of God. If you see yourself as an ambassador of the kingdom of God, and you understand that as an ambassador, the power of the entire heavens is behind you. God is with you. God is doing this with you. The power, and that's why we need to spread the gospel, because that is the power of God. So if we understand that the power of God is behind us, there's nothing to be afraid of. And for people who are saying, but what if they reject me? What if they say no? What if they shush me or kick me out of the door because I'm trying to spread the gospel? Words of encouragement from 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7 says, it's not you that they have rejected. They have rejected me as their king. So it's not about you. It's not about the words that are coming out of your mouth. It is the gospel. We're spreading the gospel. We're speaking as ambassadors of the kingdom of heaven. So the bottom line is again, this is just from verses 1 to 17, and Paul is already challenging us to make some changes. There are 3 changes that I want to talk about. There's the head change, there's the heart change, and there's the life change. For the head change, we need to know, we need to understand, we need to know that the righteousness, which is just church talk for having a right standing with God, the righteousness comes through faith in the gospel, nothing else. Having a right standing with God comes through faith in the gospel. It's not about what you do. It's not about the traditions that you observe. It's not about the denomination that you swear allegiance to. It's not about the church that you go to. It's your faith in the gospel. For your heart, the change is you need to feel unashamed. Again, we're talking about this. If you have the power behind you, the power of the entire heavens behind you, then you need to feel unashamed of the gospel. And not just unashamed, you need to be excited to share it. And for the life change, you need to we all need to spread the gospel, and the key word here is eagerly. We need to spread the gospel eagerly to those who have not yet received it. And that's just 1 to 17.
And I want to clarify something quick for we don't know who's listening, so we might have some people that are kind of still looking into their faith, or maybe they're really new to the faith. I want to clarify what the gospel is to somebody who might have not grown up in the church or not studied a lot.
Right.
Which is, and we briefly touched on just it's the good news at the beginning, but that's what gospel means. It's the good news of Jesus Christ.
It's the good news of Jesus Christ.
Who Jesus is, the Son of God, what he did for us, died for us on the cross, and then most importantly, defeated death and rose again, so that we can be saved. And so when we're talking about the gospel, when Paul's talking about the gospel, he's not talking about like these special collection of verses from Luke chapter 1, like they didn't even have chapters and verses, and some of those books were actually written after this letter. So
that's right.
Some of the books we have. So he's talking about the good news of who Jesus is and what Jesus did for us.
The fact that Jesus made a way for us to be reconciled with God.
And when we have good news, right, which is what gospel means, you know,
Mm-hmm.
when you said there at the end, like we're supposed to want to spread it eagerly. Well, who begrudgingly shares good news? It's like, Leo, I really hate to tell you this, but you just won $14 million. I'm
Right.
really sorry. Like, who does that? Like, if you have good news,
I'm sorry,
you
but
should be eager to
You
share
just
it.
passed the board exam or something.
Yeah, like terrible news for you. No, like I love that you focused on, you know, we should be spreading it eagerly to those who haven't received it because it's such good news. Like I have this amazing thing and I want
Right.
you to know about it, even though sometimes it's harder for us. But
Yeah, it's easy, and I know it's easy to say, but hard to do.
Yeah.
But and that's why Paul is challenging us, because you can't start doing this unless you make some changes.
Yeah.
And that's why we talked about the changes, because unless you give up whatever it is that you have in your hands, God can't put what he has for you in your hands. So you need to give it up and you need to make some changes, because once you do that, then you start seeing the gospel and seeing who you are and what God made you for in a different light.
yeah, that's good. Thank you, Leo. Again, that was just chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. So it's going to be awesome going through Romans with all of you. We're so glad. We're so glad that you joined us here on the Grow Podcast this week for episode 103. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe. So if you're watching us on YouTube, click subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, make sure you subscribe there as well, so you get notified when the new episodes go out every single Monday. If you want notifications and you're on your phone, you usually do have to go into your settings and turn them on, because a lot of times they're just automatically off. So if you want that notification every Monday morning to remind you to check out the Grow Podcast, make sure you turn notifications on and that you're subscribed, because we say it every week here on the Grow Podcast, but growth always starts with the next step. And this was a great next step you took being here with us to study Romans, but make sure that you're putting what we learn into practice. And
Speaking of next step, the next step for you guys, now that we've gone through verses 1 to 17, is now we go through the rest of chapter 1. So go through 18 to 32.
Yeah. And we talked last week about like the best way to read for a Bible study. And Pastor Mike talked about like read through it just once, just read through it. Just sit down, read through it. And then maybe the next day come back and you know what? I don't need to repeat the entire podcast. Go listen to last week's podcast. But reading it multiple times, being intentional about things, maybe taking some notes, would definitely help all of us as we prepare for this. But I also want to say, like, as we talk, you know, that's our homework. That's our next step for a week. But let's make sure that we're intentional this week about being unashamed to talk to others about the good news, about the gospel, to make sure we have that confidence in, you know, that the gospel is the power of God, the good news of who Jesus is and what he did for us. So
the journey of the 1,000 miles begins with the single step. So start with one.
Yeah.
Share one.
Yeah.
Share to one person and then see what happens.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you, Pastor Leo. It was awesome doing our first podcast together. I hope they enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yep.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as For those of you on audio only, Pastor Leo is aggressively fist pumping right now. We love all of you. We love all of our New Hope Network family. Whether you go to a New Hope campus, you're part of one of our church plants, or you're just finding us here on the Grow Podcast, we love you. We're so glad that you're here. We believe that you're here for a reason, and we will see you next time.